Welcome back, witchy wanderers, curious creatures, and fellow family of the craft. Welcome back to Anonymous Crone, the podcast where we stir the cauldron of wisdom, witchcraft, and the wild ways of the old gods. And tonight, we're going into the woods. Not metaphorically. Well, yeah, metaphorically too. But tonight, we're looking for people who have been haunting the imagination of Europe for more than 2,000 years. We're looking for the philosophers, the teachers, judges, poets, healers, mystics, and keepers of the sacred knowledge. And if Romans were telling the truth, occasionally the people who are having really bad days involving human sacrifices. Tonight, we are talking about the Druids. And before we get started, I'm going to give you just a little warning. If you came here expecting a clean little story about men in robes, standing around Stonehenge and hugging oak trees, speaking exclusively in mysterious whispers. Bitch, I'm gonna have to disappoint you, because the real history of the Druids is much stranger and much more dark. The ancient Druids did not leave us a Bible, they didn't leave us a Book of Shadows, they did not leave behind a neatly organized handbook titled, So You Want to Become a Druid. They left behind almost nothing in their own words. What we know about them primarily comes from people who've watched them from the outside, like the Greek and Roman writers, archaeological evidence, and much later Irish and Welsh literature. And that creates a shitstorm of historical problems. Because when the people writing about you are your neighbors, your conquerors, your enemies, or Christian writers living centuries after you've disappeared, you don't exactly get to proofread your own biography. And that's just one thing that makes the Druids so mysterious. Yeah, we know they existed. We know they were important. We know they had religious and intellectual authority. We know they were in Britain and parts of Gaul. And I had to look Gaul up because I didn't know what that was. But it's an ancient region in Western Europe, mainly covers France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Northern Italy, etc., that whole area over there. And we also know later that Irish literature remembers Druids as powerful religious specialists. But we don't know everything that the Druids believed. And anybody that tells you they know every detail of ancient Druidry, they're probably trying to sell you something. Tonight, we're going to separate the history from mythology, the evidence from speculation, and ancient Druidry from modern Druidry. Those things are related, but not identical. And that's important to keep in mind. So we're just going to start. Who were the Druids? Well, the simplest answer is that the Druids appear to have been a specialized intellectual and religious class within some ancient Celtic-speaking societies of Western Europe. And I deliberately said the word some, because here is our first misconception. The Druids were not, quote-unquote, the Celtic people. Not every person who lived in ancient Gaul was a Druid. The ancient writers describe Druids as people involved in religious rituals, teaching, law, philosophy, judgment, and the preservation of knowledge. The Roman writer, his name was Julius Caesar, you may have heard of him, gives us one of our most important descriptions. He says, Druids were involved in worship. They were involved in sacrifices, involved in religious questions, teaching, and settling disputes. He also says young men traveled to study under them, and that the Druids were held in great honor. Now imagine that. You're not simply the person who shows up on Sunday and reads from a sacred book. You are the priest, you're the philosopher, the teacher, the historian, and possibly even the judge. And that's a serious amount of authority, and that's what the Druids were. It explains something else. Why would Rome give two shits about the Druids? Because religious authority can become political very, very quickly. If a person or a group of people can influence kings, warriors, public opinion, and the relationship between a community and its gods, well, that person or that group of people are very powerful. Empires tend to become very uncomfortable around those type of people that have that kind of influence, but don't answer to them. So where did the Druids come from? Well, this is where history looks at us, shrugs its shoulders, and just walks the fuck away. Because we don't actually know their precise point of origin. Caesar claimed that Druidic teaching originated in Britain and that the students from Gaul traveled there to study. But that doesn't necessarily mean Britain was literally the birthplace of Druidry. It tells us what Caesar was told, or what he believed, or what he wanted his Roman audience to believe. Those are three very different things. The Druids existed in a world long before the concept of nations or states, and there wasn't a big old sign hanging over ancient Europe saying, "Welcome to Druid country, please enjoy your stay." Their religions were not one standardized religions with identical gods or identical rituals or identical calendars. There were regional differences. There were local gods, local customs, local sacred places. So when we say Druid, we're talking about a religious and intellectual role. The word Druid traditionally has been connected with words relating to oak, knowledge, or seeing, which is one of the reasons for the romantic image of the oak-wise or oak-knowing priest and why it became so powerful. The oak appears to have been very important to ancient Celtic religious texts. Sacred groves were very important. Natural places were very important. Rivers, springs, lakes, wells, bogs, hills, trees could all have religious significance. Let's go ahead and kill an innocent belief. A moment of silence. And here it is. Druids did not build Stonehenge. I'm sorry, I know that ruins a little mental picture you've had since childhood, but light a candle and grieve appropriately. Stonehenge is ancient beyond ancient. The monument was already incredibly old by the time the Druids enter our written record. The Druids have visited the ancient monuments. They may have regarded them as sacred, but we do not have evidence that the Druids built Stonehenge. Aww. Now, ancient Druidry wasn't necessarily the fluffy nature spirituality that some people think of now. There was ritual, there was sacrifice, there was divination, there were offerings. And according to ancient sources, there were some practices that are going to make your average modern pagan put down their tea and say, "Excuse me, what?" Yep, sacrifice. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about that, whether it's true or not. Because Caesar and other classical authors described human sacrifice among Celtic peoples and associate Druids with those rites. But here's where your crone is going to put on her little historian hat. The Romans were not neutral observers. Julius Caesar was writing about people he was conquering. His Gallic Wars was not exactly a cozy travel diary. It was political writing, propaganda. And if you're trying to convince people back home that invading another country is definitely necessary and it's useful and very heroic, well, it doesn't hurt to describe that the people you're conquering as barbaric. And, nothing says barbarian to an ancient Roman audience quite like human sacrifices. Am I right? So historians have got to treat these accounts very carefully with extreme caution. That doesn't mean we simply say, "Nah, the Romans lied about everything," because that's just irresponsible. Archaeology does provide evidence that ritual killings may have occurred in some Iron Age Celtic contexts, although the evidence is not always straightforward or universally accepted. So the responsible answer is, human sacrifice may have occurred. There is evidence that supports ritual killings in some circumstances. Ancient writers associated Druids with sacrifice, but we cannot reconstruct an exact Druidic sacrificial system from the surviving evidence. So let's go ahead and just talk about what the Druids actually did do, because the word Druid is sometimes treated as a synonym for Celtic priest. And, well, that's not entirely wrong, but it's way too small of a scope. The oldest descriptions suggest that Druids were intellectual specialists. Teachers, they preserved knowledge. And this is very fascinating because they appear to have relied heavily on oral transmission, or as we like to say now, word of mouth. Caesar describes students spending years learning. Some sources even suggest extremely long periods of training. 20 years is sometimes given in later summaries. Imagine you're signing up for Druid school when you're 17, and somebody tells you, "Great, we'll see you when you're 37. And why would oral knowledge be so important? Because knowledge is power. And if you're an 80s kid, you know that. Knowledge is power. If you are the keeper of genealogies, mythology, law, ritual, astronomy, poetry, medicine, sacred tradition, you don't necessarily want to write all of that down. especially if the written language available to you is associated with outsiders or even enemies. And there's a practical issue too. Writing something down does not necessarily preserve its meaning. I mean, you get a text, you can read it 13 different ways. And also, a written ritual can be copied, but if you're doing it word of mouth, that requires a living teacher. That means that the student just doesn't memorize the words. They have to learn the context, the pronunciation, the timing, the symbolism, the ritual actions, the stories, the exceptions, and the things that you're not supposed to do. And maybe most important, they have to learn how to think. And that's the difference between memorizing a recipe and learning to cook. Caesar specifically describes Druids as having authority in disputes. They could function as judges or arbitrators. They weren't simply standing in a grove chanting at the moon. They were involved in the functioning of society. And that tells us something very important. Ancient Druidry was not necessarily an escape from society, it was embedded in it. So what exactly did they believe? Well, here's where we hit our head against the wall again, because we don't have a Druidic scripture. So we have to reconstruct beliefs from outside sources, archaeology, and later traditions. And one of the beliefs that appear in the ancient descriptions is the idea that the soul survived death. Caesar describes Druids teaching that the soul did not simply die with the body and it could pass from one body to another. And that has been interpreted as reincarnation or transmigration. Now, whether every Druid believed exactly the same thing, we have no idea. But the idea that the soul continues beyond death appears to have been important enough to be recorded. Imagine the psychological consequences of really believing that death was not the end. You would look at mortality a lot different. You might see one life as a chapter rather than an entire book. And you might see your ancestors as continuing participants in the world. You might understand courage a little differently. And you might not be as nearly terrified of death. And that might help explain another thing that Caesar wrote about the Gauls. He described warriors being less afraid of death because of their beliefs about their soul. Now again, Caesar's also writing about the people he's conquering, so we don't swallow it whole, but it is consistent with the broader theme of the soul continuing beyond our physical death. So let's talk about magic. Did Druids practice magic? Well, the writers of old certainly portray them as having supernatural or magical knowledge. They were associated with divination. They interpreted signs. They were connected with sacred plants. They were involved in rituals. They were believed to possess knowledge that ordinary people just didn't have. What we can say for sure is that ancient Celtic religious practices included offerings, sacred places, divination, ritual relationships with gods and supernatural forces. And yes, plants mattered. Water, animals, trees, seasons, the sky, they all mattered. The boundary between nature and religion was not as rigid as it often is in modern Western life, and it might be one of the greatest lessons that modern Druidry has inherited. So where did the Druids go? Well, the Roman Empire expanded into Celtic lands and eventually into Britain. So Rome had this complicated relationship with local religions. But the Druids presented a very different problem to them, because they were influential and they could hold authority outside of Roman institutions. Rome had a very particular interest in controlling all religious power. In Britain, the Roman attack on the Druid stronghold of Anglesey is one of the most famous episodes in Druid history. The Roman historian Tacitus describes the Roman governor attacking Mona, which is modern Anglesey. The Druids were portrayed as standing against a Roman army with ritual specialists and defenders gathering on the island. Imagine that the Roman soldiers are approaching the shore. Across the water, the Druids are just standing there. Dark robes, raised arms, women crying curses, sacred fires, the island itself becoming a final sanctuary of an older religious order. Now we have to be careful though, because Tacitus wrote dramatically, but the event itself does fit the broader pattern of Roman suppression of Druidic authority. And eventually the old Druidic institutions disappeared from historical record. And not necessarily overnight, and it's not because that all the Druids were just rounded up and killed. That's another popular misconception. Religions don't really vanish like somebody flipped the light switch. People adapt, they hide, they compromise, and sometimes they convert. Christianity eventually transformed Ireland and Britain and much of Western Europe. But interestingly, The medieval Irish literary traditions still contain Druids, but now they appear in a Christianized literary world. They're often portrayed as magicians and prophets and sorcerers, rivals to Christian holy figures, and characters with supernatural abilities. And this is where we have to distinguish the historical Druids from the Druids of medieval mythology, because they're not the same thing. The medieval stories are valuable. They teach us how later cultures imagine their pre-Christian past, but they're not direct transcripts from Druidic practice. So now the 18th and 19th century rolls around, and things get a little spicier. We're talking about the Druid revival. The modern Druid revival did not simply rise from an unbroken line of ancient priests passing their secrets from master to apprentice. During the 18th century, intellectuals, antiquarians, poets, and romantics became fascinated with the ancient Celts. People began looking backward at Britain's prehistoric monuments and wondering about Druids. And because the actual historical record was so thin, people started filling in the blanks. Sometimes creatively, sometimes wildly. William Stuckley, for example, he was an 18th century antiquarian, fascinated by Stonehenge and Druids. He helped popularize the associations between the Druids and the ancient monuments. The problem there? As we said, the Druids did not build Stonehenge. But once an idea becomes popular, it's incredibly difficult to kill. It's like glitter. You think you cleaned it up, but there's still glitter in your house 7 years later. Druid revivalism continued through the 19th century. Some groups developed fraternal and ceremonial traditions. Others emphasized Celtic identity. Others emphasized nature spirituality. Others created elaborate systems drawing from mythology, Christianity, Freemasonry, occultism, romanticism, and folklore. So modern Druidry isn't just one thing. There are multiple modern Druid organizations. Some are Reconstructionist, some are more eclectic, some are explicitly polytheistic, some are philosophical and nature-centered, some draw heavily on Celtic mythology, some incorporate traditions from other Indo-European cultures, some are initiatory, some are open and educational, some focus on environmental work, some focus on poetry and creativity, and some just focus on ritual. One of the most influential modern Druid organizations is the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, usually called OBOD, or OBOD. So when did it really catch on in America? Well, in 1963, students at Carleton College in Minnesota, they were all required to attend some sort of religious services or spiritual programming. And this is where Druidry in America becomes a little bit more popular. So basically, a group of kids got together, and they're like, we're not going to church. Let's figure out something, and we can do something that's a lot more fun than sitting in pews on Sunday morning. So they formed a group called the Reformed Druids of North America. They did it as a protest against compulsory religious attendance at the Carleton College. So this organization, the Reformed Druids of North America, eventually just blew up. There were so many people that were like, this is really cool. And from that group, it spawned other Druid organizations. The college eventually abandoned the religious attendance requirement, but the kids there loved it so much, they decided to continue practicing. They loved gathering outdoors. They liked the ritual. They liked the nature spirituality of it. They liked asking philosophical questions. They liked their community. So where are they now? Where are the Druids in America? Well, pretty much all over. It's like being pagan, and we're spread just everywhere. But there are some areas where modern Druid communities appear pretty visible. Like the Pacific Northwest is a particularly notable center, especially around Oregon, where multiple Druid groups and groves have existed. Portland's Columbia Grove, for example, is an active ADF grove serving the Portland and surrounding pagan communities. As far as the biggest Druid population, we don't actually know. There's no reliable United States census asking for Druids. The modern Druid movement is decentralized. People belong to all kinds of organizations. While Oregon, particularly the Portland area, has a notably visible and active Druid community, but I wouldn't tell you that Oregon is definitely the largest population of Druids in America. We just don't have the census data to prove it. So what do modern Druids actually do? Well, some celebrate seasonal festivals. Many other Druids observe the solstices and equinoxes and other seasonal festivals associated with the wheel of the year. Many honor the gods and spirits. Some work with ancestors, some practice meditation, some work with trees and plants, some engage in environmental activism, some study Celtic mythology, some study Indo-European religion, some do rituals outdoors, some have groves. And when I'm talking about groves is like a gathering of something. You can have a grove of trees. You can have a grove of people who come together and talk about the trees. It's kind of like a druidic coven, if you will. And I know some of you druids out there are like, listen, bitch, it's not quite like that. I'm just simplifying it. But basically, there's often an underlying emphasis on the natural world and developing a direct relationship with the land. This can mean something as simple as just knowing the trees around their home, knowing the birds, knowing when the first frost usually comes, knowing where the water runs, knowing what plants bloom in spring, knowing the land's history, knowing whose footsteps came before yours. And if we strip away the fantasy and look at what the historical and modern traditions emphasize, I would say one of the greatest strengths of the Druids is knowledge. The Druids were remembered as educated specialists. They preserved tradition, they taught, they advised, they understood their ritual. Their authority came from what they knew. Another strength was adaptability. Ancient religious traditions didn't survive unchanged. They couldn't. Because cultures changed, languages, political stuff. People migrate, empires invade, and modern Druidry demonstrates this. Modern Druids, they're not recreating an ancient religion perfectly, because that's not possible. But modern Druids are still teachers. They're still artists and parents and scientists, gardeners, historians, poets, students. They're people who work regular jobs and then go home and light a candle for Bridget. They are still the people who celebrate solstice, people who spend weekends planting trees, people who study ancient languages, who write poetry, who sit in groves, people who practice alone, and people who simply feel that the old relationship between humans and the living earth still has something to teach us. And maybe that's why the Druid arts continue to attract people, because we're living in a world that is technologically astonishing but leaves us spiritually hungry. I mean, we can communicate with someone on the other side of the planet in just a couple seconds, right? We can map distant galaxies. We can carry an entire library in our pocket. And yet, we still don't know how to sit quietly with ourselves. We still wonder what happens after death. We still stand beneath the stars. We still fear the dark. And we still ask, what makes a life meaningful? You know, the Druids lived with those questions too. They just answered them through different cultural languages, through their gods, through land, through ritual, through ancestors, through story, through seasons. Before we move on to question and answers, I want you to remember something from tonight. The ancient Druids are mysterious because they didn't leave us enough of themselves. Modern Druids are fascinating because they're trying to build something meaningful from what survived. And yes, they have two different stories. And that, my loves, is where we're going to leave our Druids tonight, standing somewhere between history and legend, between the ancient grove and the modern world, somewhere beneath the branches, where the wind moves through the leaves. And we remember that long before we started putting concrete over everything, we belonged to the earth. And maybe in some small way, we still do. All right, it's time for question and answers. This part of the pod is where I answer your questions that you send me, DM on any social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Or that you've emailed me at acronepodcast@gmail.com. Today's question comes from Mars Fox. Mars Fox says, so I've been pagan for a while, but I'm still trying to find the right path. I was wondering if the Druids worship a specific deity or a set of deities, or if nature itself is what's being worshipped. Thank you. Well, hello. And that is a really good question, because Druidry isn't quite as simple as, quote unquote, they worship nature. Historically, Druids were part of the Celtic religion and cultural traditions, and their beliefs probably included reverence for many gods and many spirits connected to nature. There wasn't necessarily one universal set of deities that every Druid followed. And modern Druidry is wonderfully varied. Some Druids are polytheistic and honor specific Celtic deities, while others view nature itself as sacred without worshiping any individual gods. Some are animists, seeing spirit or consciousness within the natural world and everything, and some approach Druidry more philosophically than religiously. So if you are exploring Druidry, there really isn't one right way to begin. Just follow the path that makes you feel connected to the land or the seasons or your ancestors or whatever you consider sacred. The Druids would probably just tell you to go spend some time under a tree and start there. So thank you for sending in your question. I hope I answered it. And if anyone listening out there has a cool story or questions or comments, you can always email me at acronepodcast@gmail.com. And yes, I want your weird stories, your strange dreams, and your encounters. As usual, here is your crone's blessing. May oak roots hold you where the wild winds blow. May ancient wisdom teach your spirit where to go. May fire warm your heart and moonlight guide your way. May earth remind you what is sacred every day. May rivers carry sorrow far from where you stand. May trees teach you patience, strength, and how to understand. And when you walk between the worlds, beneath the stars above, may the old gods guard your path with wisdom, wildness, and love. Until next time, remember the oldest wisdom isn't always written in books. It may be rustling in the leaves, flowing beneath your feet, and waiting for you to slow down enough to listen. See you next week here at Anonymous Crone.